Tonight, a human being enters complete isolation for 50 years. Not prison, not a meditation retreat. Total separation from every other person on earth. No voices, no faces, no touch, no acknowledgement that they exist. What happens when the most social species suddenly has no society at all? The mind doesn't just break. It follows a precise schedule of dissolution. Each stage arrives like clockwork. Each breakdown builds on the last. The destruction is systematic and inevitable. Before we explore this dark territory, drop a comment about where you're listening from tonight. These journeys into human extremes work best when shared. Your thoughts help guide future investigations. If these quiet investigations resonate, consider subscribing. This is what isolation does to consciousness itself. It starts with the first morning. A hand pushes against the final door. Metal clicks into place. The lock engages for 50 years. The heart explodes into rapid hammering. Breath comes in desperate gasps. Fingers shake as they touch the sealed entrance. Every nerve screams death. Muscles tense for escape that cannot happen. Blood pounds through temples. The chest squeezes like hands closing around lungs. Pupils stretch wide, searching for threats in empty space. Phantom footsteps echo from silent hallways. Voices whisper from rooms containing nothing. The brain manufactures human presence rather than accept complete abandonment. Eyes refuse to close through the first night. Each small sound becomes approaching danger. Wall expansion becomes footsteps. Air circulation becomes distant conversation. The mind stitches stories onto ordinary house noises. A palm presses against a racing chest. Heartbeats feel violent enough to crack ribs. Air tastes thin and insufficient. The mouth opens and closes like a fish drowning in atmosphere. Fear locks into permanent activation. Pressure swells behind the breastbone. Words pile up like water behind a cracking dam. The mouth bursts open. Speech pours towards ceiling corners. Questions spill to chairs. Confessions spill to walls. The voice climbs louder and more frantic, as if volume could summon replies. The lamp receives detailed childhood confessions. Windows hear requests for relationship advice. Doors get asked about career decisions. Every object becomes a conversation partner. Words become unstoppable. Observations about temperature. Descriptions of dreams. Memories of books from years past. The social brain continues its patterns with nowhere to land. Objects develop distinct personalities. The chair offers sympathy. The table displays preferences. The mirror provides imagined counsel through its silent surface. Communication urges turn painful. Chest pressure demands release through speech. Silence feels like suffocation. Lips move constantly, forming words that vanish into empty air. The lamp becomes a concerned friend receiving daily updates. The ceiling transforms into a therapist. Furniture absorbs all the human connection the isolated mind desperately requires. Objects become family within days. The bedsheets feel wrong against skin. Eyelids snap open at random intervals. Sleep abandons the isolated brain. Normal rest patterns collapse completely. The body attempts sleep, then jolts awake every few minutes. Internal clocks malfunction without social cues. Day and night blend into meaningless gray stretches. Dreams invade waking moments. Conversations play out with people who exist only in memory. The boundary between sleep and consciousness dissolves. Reality becomes negotiable. The exhaustion builds like poison in the bloodstream. Eyes burn from forced alertness. The brain struggles to process basic information. Simple tasks require enormous effort. Micro-sleeps begin during standing moments. The body collapses into brief unconsciousness while walking. Awareness flickers on and off like a failing light bulb. Hallucinations emerge from sleep deprivation. Shadows move independently. Peripheral vision fills with approaching figures. The brain creates stimulation to replace missing sensory input. Time becomes elastic and meaningless. Minutes stretch into hours. Hours compress into seconds. The internal clock that regulated a lifetime simply stops functioning. Sleep becomes the enemy rather than relief. A floorboard creaks in the empty hallway. Muscles freeze mid-movement. Someone is coming. Every tiny sound triggers full alertness. Footstep patterns emerge from random house settling. The heating system becomes approaching strangers. Air through vents transforms into distant conversation. Ears strain constantly for human sounds. The brain amplifies background noise, searching for voices. Refrigerator hums become whispered discussions. Water pipes become door handles turning. Sound interpretation becomes completely unreliable. Weaned through building gaps becomes calling voices. Electrical humming transforms into radio chatter. The isolated brain creates human presence from mechanical noise. Hearing sharpens to painful sensitivity. Normal house sounds feel deafening. The rustle of clothing becomes thunderous. Breathing sounds echo like stadium announcements. False alarms trigger dozens of times daily. Racing to windows expecting visitors. Checking doors that remain locked. Searching empty rooms after hearing clear conversation. The auditory system redesigns itself around absence. Every sound becomes potential human contact. The brain refuses to accept that no voices will ever penetrate this space. Silence becomes more terrifying than noise. A face appears in the bathroom mirror. Eyes make contact with eyes. The conversation begins. The reflection starts responding independently. Questions directed toward the mirror receive imagined answers. Facial expressions change as if belonging to someone else. The mirror person develops distinct opinions and personality traits. Full conversations develop with the reflected self. Morning discussions about daily plans. Evening debriefs about activities. The mirror companion becomes the primary social interaction. Gestures flow between the real person and reflection. Hand movements become shared communication. Facial expressions create dialogue. The glass surface becomes a portal to human connection. The reflection begins offering advice. Mirror conversations grow complex and detailed. The other self expresses different preferences, different concerns, different memories. Arguments develop between person and reflection. Disagreements about decisions. Conflicts about past choices. The mirror relationship becomes as complicated as any human friendship. Eye contact with the reflection feels like genuine human interaction. The brain processes the reflected face as belonging to another person. Social needs find satisfaction through self-conversation. The mirror becomes the most important relationship in an empty world. Fingers hover over scattered numbers on paper. 3 plus 7 equals something impossible. The pencil trembles between unsteady digits. Simple arithmetic transforms into incomprehensible puzzles. Numbers float on the page without meaning. Addition becomes as foreign as advanced calculus once felt. The brain reaches for logical connections that no longer exist. Even the simplest sums give different answers each time. Mathematical relationships dissolve into meaningless symbols scratched on deteriorating paper. Reasoning chains break after single links, if-then statements collapse before completion. The mind grasps for cause and effect patterns, but finds only scattered fragments of thought. Problem-solving attempts produce bizarre results. Logical steps skip randomly. Conclusions arrive without premises. The thinking process becomes a broken machine producing nonsensical output. Mental arithmetic vanishes completely. counting past your fingers requires enormous concentration. Basic number recognition flickers in and out like a failing light. Math becomes a foreign language the brain has forgotten how to speak. A book lies open deep into the chapter. Words stare back like unfamiliar strangers. The mouth opens but produces only silence. Common words slip away from recognition. Beautiful becomes a sound without meaning. Telephone transforms into incomprehensible syllables. Vocabulary shrinks like a slowly deflating balloon. Sentences fragment into word-shaped holes. The brain reaches for sophisticated but finds empty space. Magnificent disappears from available options. Language becomes increasingly basic and primitive. Reading comprehension collapses paragraph by paragraph. Complex sentences feel like foreign literature. Simple phrases require multiple attempts to decode. Text becomes visual noise rather than communication. Speech patterns simplify drastically. Long words vanish first. Descriptive language disappears. Conversations reduce to elementary combinations of basic terms. The tongue searches for words that no longer exist in memory. Thoughts form but cannot find expression. Language becomes a shrinking island in an ocean of silence. Vocabulary becomes childhood simple within weeks. Eyes scan the first sentence of an open book. Attention drifts before reaching the period. The page blurs into meaningless patterns. Focus dissolves after seconds rather than minutes. Reading attempts fail before completing single paragraphs. The mind wanders to empty corners and returns to forgotten starting points. Thoughts jump between random topics without connection. Concentration becomes like trying to hold water in cupped hands. Mental energy scatters in all directions simultaneously. Simple tasks fragment into impossible challenges. Making coffee requires multiple restarts. Each step disappears before completion. Instructions become meaningless sequences of forgotten actions. The brain refuses sustained attention on any subject. Television programs become incomprehensible. Books transform into decorative objects. Written material loses all meaning beyond first glances. Sustained thinking becomes physically exhausting. Mental effort produces immediate fatigue. Concentration attempts trigger headaches and confusion. Focus becomes a skill the isolated mind completely forgets. A cup sits abandoned on the kitchen counter. Steam no longer rises from cold coffee. The memory of making it vanishes completely. Recent actions dissolve like sugar in water. Walking to the bathroom disappears from recall before returning to bed. Conversations with objects fade seconds after ending. Short-term storage malfunctions catastrophically. Names of furniture become unreachable. The purpose of completed tasks evaporates. Memory formation simply stops functioning. Yesterday blends with last week. This morning feels like ancient history. The timeline of recent events becomes a scrambled mess of disconnected fragments. Basic information fails to stick. The location of everyday items becomes a mystery requiring fresh searches. Routine activities need complete relearning each attempt. Memory formation malfunctions. New experiences pass through consciousness without leaving traces. The brain becomes unable to encode recent information. The present moment becomes the only reality the mind can access. A door handle turns, but the door stays closed. The solution requires impossible mental gymnastics. Frustration builds without resolution. Basic problem-solving skills evaporate completely. Stuck zippers become engineering challenges. Dead light bulbs create unsolvable mysteries. Simple fixes require superhuman cognitive effort. The brain approaches obstacles with increasing helplessness. Cause and effect reasoning disappears. Logical troubleshooting becomes as foreign as quantum physics. Daily maintenance tasks transform into impossible puzzles. Cleaning spills requires multiple failed attempts. Organizing objects creates chaotic arrangements. Simple repairs become permanently abandoned projects. Creative solutions vanish from mental options. Flexible thinking rigidifies into repetitive loops. Innovation dies as cognitive pathways narrow and close. The isolated mind loses its ability to adapt and overcome even minor obstacles. Problems accumulate like bris around a broken drain. Intelligence becomes a tool the brain no longer remembers how to use. Silence fills the throat like thick honey. Vocal cords sit motionless for endless hours. The mouth forgets its primary function. Words retreat deeper into unused memory. The urge to speak diminishes with each passing day. Conversations with objects become shorter than stop. Hours stretch without a single syllable. The jaw remains closed. Lips seal into permanent lines. Speaking becomes an abandoned activity like a forgotten hobby. Entire days pass in wordless existence. The tongue rests against teeth without forming sounds. Breath flows without carrying language. Communication dies through simple neglect. The voice box grows stiff from disuse. Throat muscles weaken without exercise. Speaking apparatus begins its slow shutdown. Language becomes unnecessary background noise from a previous life. Silence transforms from absence into presence. Quiet fills every room with its own weight. The isolated mind discovers that words were always optional. The mouth becomes an organ for eating only. The bedroom contains scattered thoughts without connection. Subject and verb divorce permanently. Sentences fragment into verbal debris. Grammar collapses like a house losing its foundation. I need water becomes water need. Complex structures simplify into caveman basics. Linguistic sophistication evaporates. Articles disappear first. The inner vanish from available options. Prepositions follow quickly behind. Language strips down to essential nouns and desperate verbs. Word order randomizes. Door open want replaces I want to open the door. Syntax becomes meaningless decoration. Communication reduces to primitive word combinations. Verb tenses flatten into eternal present. Past and future disappear from expression. Time markers become foreign concepts. Language exists only in the immediate moment. Complex thoughts find no grammatical expression. Multiple clauses become impossible. Dependent phrases disappear entirely. Sophisticated ideas die without linguistic vehicles. Words become isolated islands floating in silent oceans. Text swims across the page like drowning insects. Letters lose their ancient meanings. Written language transforms into decorative patterns. Reading becomes archaeology of forgotten skills. Simple sentences feel like encrypted messages. Words appear familiar but refuse to surrender their meanings. Books transform into collections of meaningless symbols. Paragraphs become visual noise. Text resembles artistic decoration rather than communication. Written language dies behind living eyes. The alphabet reverts to primitive drawings. Letters lose their phonetic connections. Cat becomes three unrelated shapes. Words dissolve into component scribbles without significance. Comprehension attempts produce exhaustion. Reading single sentences requires enormous mental effort. Simple phrases trigger confusion and headaches. Literacy becomes a superhuman challenge. Written instructions become impossible hieroglyphics. Signs provide no useful information. Text disappears from conscious understanding. The brain treats writing like abstract art. Books become expensive paperweights gathering dust. Breath catches on unused vocal cords. Sound emerges as rusty grinding. The voice becomes a stranger's instrument. Throat muscles atrophy from months of silence. Speaking attempts produce harsh croaking. Clear pronunciation becomes impossible. The voice box transforms into a broken musical instrument. Words emerge as damaged approximations. Consonants blur into vowel soup. Syllables merge and separate randomly. Speech becomes incomprehensible even to its producer. The tongue loses precise motor control. Articulation degrades into sloppy approximation. Clear speech requires conscious effort for single syllables. Language becomes physically exhausting. Breath control disappears completely. Words emerge in gasping bursts. Smooth speech flow vanishes. Communication becomes a series of vocal emergencies. The larynx forgets its trained behaviors. Professional speech patterns dissolve. Accent disappears into generic roughness. The voice becomes primitive and unrecognizable. Speaking becomes painful mechanical friction. Hands rise to express simple needs. Gestures replace vocabulary entirely. The body speaks what the mouth cannot. Arms wave frantically to indicate basic desires. Pointing becomes the primary communication tool. Facial expressions carry emotional weight that words once held. Grunts emerge for yes and no responses. Moaning expresses frustration and pleasure. Sighing communicates complex emotional states. Vocal sounds become animal expressions. Hand signals develop personal meanings. Touching objects indicates wants. Physical movement replaces verbal explanation. The body becomes the only available language. Emotional expression reduces to primitive sounds. Happiness becomes high-pitched humming. Anger transforms into low growling. Sadness flows through wordless sobbing. Complex thoughts remain trapped without expression. Internal monologues continue silently. The gap between thinking and communicating becomes an unbridgeable chasm. Language becomes extinct while consciousness remains intact. The kitchen table holds scattered photographs. Faces stare upward from paper surfaces. Eyes scan the images without recognition. Smiling expressions trigger no emotional response. Tears frozen in photographs produce no sympathy. Happy family moments appear as meaningless arrangements of light and shadow. Memory provides factual information without feeling. Mother's face registers as familiar visual pattern. Father's embrace becomes geometric composition. Emotional significance evaporates completely from human images. The concept of pain in others becomes abstract theory. Suffering transforms into distant curiosity. Joy in remembered faces feels like observing weather patterns. Human emotions become foreign and unreadable. Emotional memory detaches from visual triggers. Love becomes undefined concept. Sadness loses personal meaning. The heart views human connection like studying insects under glass. Past relationships reduce to historical data. Friends become names without attachment. Family members transform into biological categories. Human bonds dissolve into meaningless social arrangements. Photographs become colorful paper rectangles containing stranger-shaped objects. Clothes pile in forgotten corners gathering dust. Soap sits unused beside stained sinks. The body operates outside invisible rules. Nakedness feels natural and unremarkable. Clothing becomes unnecessary decoration. Modesty disappears like an abandoned foreign custom. The skin breathes freely without social constraints. Hygiene routines vanish without conscious decision. Teeth yellow from neglect. Hair mats into unwashed tangles. Body odor becomes normal background presence. Cleanliness loses all perceived value. Table manners disappear entirely. Food gets consumed with bare hands. Eating becomes purely functional activity. Proper behavior codes evaporate without social witnesses to maintain appearances. Politeness becomes meaningless concept. Please and thank you die from disuse. Courtesy transforms into forgotten ritual. Manners become as foreign as diplomatic protocol. Social expectations lose all compelling force. Rules exist only in distant memory. Behavioral standards collapse without peer pressure. Civilized conduct becomes optional performance art. The body operates like a wild animal ignoring human conventions. Food hoards accumulate in defensive piles. Hands clutch possessions against imaginary thieves. Sharing becomes impossible mental exercise. Every object transforms into personal treasure. Books must remain in exact positions. Furniture belongs exclusively to its current user. Territory expands to include all visible space. The concept of giving disappears completely. Lending becomes meaningless action. Generosity transforms into suspicious foreign behavior. Resources exist only for individual consumption. Compromise skills evaporate entirely. Alternative solutions vanish from consideration. Negotiation becomes impossible exercise. Winner-take-all becomes the only operating principle. Competition extends to interactions with inanimate objects. Chairs must submit to personal dominance. Tables serve only individual needs. Every surface becomes conquered territory requiring constant defense. Resource distribution reduces to simple possession rules. First contact equals permanent ownership. Previously shared spaces become individual kingdoms. Cooperation transforms into forgotten childhood game. Everything becomes mine by default occupation. A calendar hangs crooked showing meaningless numbers. Days blur together without distinction. Time moves forward without planning guidance. Tomorrow becomes foreign concept. Next week disappears from consideration. Future planning feels like imagining impossible worlds. Time extends only to immediate present moment. Schedules transform into incomprehensible hieroglyphics. Appointments become meaningless historical artifacts. Deadlines lose all compelling urgency. Calendar dates provide no useful information. Goal setting becomes impossible exercise. Long-term objectives vanish completely. Progress toward distant rewards feels pointless. Achievement requires only immediate gratification. Cause and effect thinking collapses across time. Actions disconnect from future consequences. Preparation becomes meaningless activity. Planning ahead feels unreal. Decision-making reduces to immediate impulse satisfaction. Delayed gratification becomes impossible concept. Future consequences disappear from consideration. Present moment becomes eternal reality. The clock ticks toward nowhere in particular. A kitchen knife reflects fluorescent ceiling lights. Sharp metal edge catches available illumination. Moral boundaries dissolve around potential weapons. Right and wrong become empty word categories. Harmful actions trigger no emotional resistance. Ethical guidelines vanish without social enforcement. Moral constraints disappear like melted barriers. Violence becomes practical problem-solving method. Destruction offers immediate satisfaction. Causing damage produces no guilt or hesitation. Ethics transform into optional social performance. Property damage feels morally neutral. Breaking objects provides stress relief. Destruction becomes acceptable entertainment. Vandalism loses negative associations completely. Pain infliction becomes curious experimentation. Suffering transforms into interesting phenomenon. Cruelty develops into casual exploration. Empathy barriers collapse entirely around harmful actions. Conscience becomes silent, inactive organ. Guilt disappears from emotional vocabulary. Remorse transforms into forgotten feeling. Moral agency evaporates without social witnesses. Good and evil become meaningless philosophical distinctions floating in empty space. Heat radiates from empty chair cushions. Invisible guests settle into furniture across the living room. The air vibrates with approaching footsteps. Conversations bloom between the isolated person and transparent visitors. Voices emerge from vacant corners, speaking in familiar tones. Old friends materialize for afternoon discussions about shared memories that never happened. Hands reach out to touch shoulders that exist only in perception. Solid contact registers against palm surfaces. Warm skin pressure spreads across fingertips, touching nothing but air. Phantom cooking smells drift from unused kitchens. Coffee percolates in empty pots. Bacon sizzles on cold stove surfaces. Familiar food aromas trigger salivation responses to meals that exist nowhere. Musical performances unfold in silent rooms. Orchestra sections emerge from specific wall locations. Violins sing from ceiling corners while drums pulse through floor vibrations. Concert halls materialize around single listeners. Multiple senses combine to create complete alternate reality. Touch confirms what eyes observe. Smell supports what ears detect. Imaginary visitors feel more real than remembered actual people. A childhood bedroom materializes around the adult body. Small hands reach for toys scattered across remembered carpets. Age becomes a fluid and negotiable concept. Yesterday blends seamlessly with decades past. High school conversations continue in present tense. Childhood birthday parties occur simultaneously with current moments. Time layers collapse into single experiential plane. The mirror reflects faces from different life periods. Sometimes young features appear in silver surfaces. Other moments reveal elderly characteristics. Age fluctuates based on active memory periods. Parents enter rooms for conversations interrupted years ago. Dead relatives resume daily interactions. Deceased pets return for continued companionship. Death becomes temporary absence rather than permanent separation. Current location transforms into previous addresses. Childhood homes materialize around present surroundings. Different time periods occupy identical physical spaces. Geography becomes as fluid as chronology. Memory and immediate experience merge completely. Past events gain present immediacy. Historical moments feel currently active. The present moment becomes just another memory competing for attention. The bathroom mirror reflects unfamiliar facial expressions. Different personalities emerge through changing eye movements. One body houses multiple complete strangers. Morning brings confident business executive characteristics. Afternoon reveals shy artistic tendencies. Evening produces aggressive survival instincts. Personality shifts occur without conscious control. Different identities prefer specific furniture arrangements. One personality reorganizes books alphabetically. Another identity scatters objects randomly. Conflicting organizational systems battle for environmental control. Voice patterns change with personality transitions. Confident identity speaks in low authoritative tones. Fearful identity whispers in high nervous pitches. Multiple vocal signatures emerge from single throat. Memory access varies between identities. Some personalities remember childhood clearly. Others retain only recent experiences. Information becomes compartmentalized between different internal residents. Clothing preferences shift dramatically with identity changes. Conservative identity selects formal attire. Rebellious identity prefers unusual combinations. Multiple fashion sensibilities compete for expression. One physical body becomes a crowded apartment building housing diverse tenants. Furniture drifts slowly across room surfaces. Chairs relocate themselves during unobserved moments. Gravity operates under different rules for different objects. Walls breathe with gentle expansion rhythms. Paint surfaces pulse like living skin. Room dimensions fluctuate throughout daily cycles. Architecture becomes organic and responsive. Books rearrange themselves on shifting shelves. Text flows across pages like moving water. Letters dance between lines, creating new meanings. Written language becomes dynamic performance art. Shadows move independently of light sources. Dark shapes slide across floors without casting objects. Silhouettes perform elaborate dances on blank wall surfaces. Darkness gains autonomous mobility. Colors shift spontaneously across object surfaces. Red chairs become blue during observation. White walls cycle through rainbow spectrums. Pigmentation follows emotional rather than physical laws. Floor patterns rearrange into complex geometric designs. Ceiling fixtures rotate in slow ceremonial circles. Windows frame different landscapes during single days. Interior space becomes kaleidoscope of constant change. Reality operates like elaborate theater production with continuously changing stage sets. Electrical outlets pulse with supernatural energy. Current flows through fingertips into household circuits. The isolated body becomes conduit for cosmic forces. Special abilities manifest during ordinary activities. Light switches respond to mental commands. Electronic devices activate through concentrated thought. Technology submits to psychic influence. Sacred missions emerge from random daily events. Specific number sequences carry divine messages. Arrangement of household objects reveals cosmic instructions. Every detail contains profound spiritual significance. Secret government surveillance becomes obvious reality. Hidden cameras monitor from picture frames. Mysterious organizations track all movements. Important conspiracies revolve around a single isolated individual. Telepathic communication develops with distant strangers. Thoughts transmit across impossible distances. Mental conversations occur with world leaders. Global events respond to personal meditation sessions. Supernatural enemies infiltrate through common objects. Evil forces inhabit kitchen appliances. Dark entities possess furniture items. Daily life becomes a constant battle between cosmic forces. The isolated mind becomes the center of a universal drama requiring constant heroic vigilance. The kitchen window frames identical gray skies. Morning light feels exactly like evening shadows. Clocks tick without measuring anything meaningful. Minutes stretch into geological epochs. Hours compress into something too fast to track. The clock face looks like a prop. Duration loses all reference points. The digital display shows changing numbers without significance. 3/47 feels identical to any other time. Timestamps become meaningless symbols. Chronology dissolves into random sequences. Meals occur when hunger strikes without schedule. Sleep arrives randomly throughout day-night cycles. Activities happen in response to immediate impulse, not planning. Biological rhythms drift apart from mechanical time. Sunrise and sunset become lighting variations without temporal meaning. Darkness and brightness cycle like weather patterns. Day-night transitions feel like lamp switches, not passages. Clock hands move through empty space pointing toward nothing. Calendar pages remain unturned for unknown periods. Time measurement becomes forgotten technology from previous civilization. Duration becomes a concept the isolated mind completely abandons. Wrinkled hands reach for toys that disappeared decades ago. The body moves with childlike curiosity through adult spaces. Age markers dissolve into irrelevant statistics. A child's mind inhabits an older body. Childhood fears rise through mature vocal patterns. Adult responsibilities feel like elaborate games that demand pretend participation. Birthday celebrations from distant decades feel currently active. Candle blowing occurs on invisible cakes. Age progression reverses during specific memory episodes. Temporal identity becomes costume changes, not a line. School uniforms feel more natural than current clothing. Playground rules govern adult behavior patterns. Childhood friends seem more present than adult acquaintances ever were. Educational lessons replay with fresh immediacy. Physical aging becomes external decoration, not identity. Wrinkles appear on borrowed skin belonging to stranger bodies. Gray hair grows on heads that still feel brunette. Bodily changes happen to other people wearing familiar faces. Past decisions feel like current considerations requiring immediate attention. Life choices replay endlessly without resolution. Historical events become present dilemmas demanding fresh solutions. The isolated mind becomes ageless consciousness trapped in time-traveling flesh. Salt crystals scatter across unchanged table surfaces. Days pass without creating memorable moments. Experience flows through consciousness like water through open drains. New events register momentarily, then vanish completely. Morning activities disappear before afternoon arrives. Recent conversations evaporate while still echoing. Fresh experiences become instantly historical. Memory formation machinery shuts down entirely. Current moments refuse to solidify into retrievable information. Present experiences turn slippery and ungraspable. New data passes through awareness without sticking. Repeated activities feel completely novel each occurrence. Every meal becomes the first meal. Each book reading feels like an initial encounter. Familiar objects appear surprisingly unfamiliar during every interaction. Learning stops functioning altogether. New information enters consciousness briefly, then disappears. Skill development becomes impossible without memory consolidation. Knowledge acquisition reverses into constant forgetting. Daily routines require fresh discovery each repetition. Simple tasks need complete relearning every attempt. Previously mastered activities become perpetually mysterious challenges. The present moment becomes eternal because nothing else exists to remember. The pillow fabric feels rougher against cheek than remembered silk sheets. Eyes open into dreams that continue operating. Sleep and wake become indistinguishable states of being. But dream conversations carry more weight than waking thoughts. Fantasy relationships feel more substantial than physical solitude. Imaginary achievements provide greater satisfaction than actual accomplishments. Sleep experiences generate stronger emotional responses than conscious activities. Dream events trigger authentic tears and laughter. Fantasy scenarios produce real physical sensations. Unconscious narratives become primary reality. Waking moments feel like brief interruptions between important dream sequences. Consciousness becomes intermittent distraction from more meaningful sleep stories. Eyes close to return to authentic existence. Dream characters develop consistent personalities across multiple sleep cycles. Fantasy relationships maintain continuity between unconscious episodes. Sleep narratives progress logically while waking life fragments into confusion. Physical actions feel like clumsy imitations of graceful dream movements. Walking becomes awkward compared to dream flight. Speech sounds harsh compared to dream telepathy. Dreams become headquarters while waking life becomes occasional field trips. Window glass reveals unchanging landscape temperatures. Snow and sunshine feel equally meaningless. Weather becomes background noise without seasonal significance. Temperature variations trigger no preparation responses. Hot and cold become arbitrary atmospheric conditions. Seasonal clothing changes stop occurring entirely. Weather adaptation becomes forgotten survival skill. Holiday celebrations lose temporal anchoring. Christmas ornaments could appear during any temperature period. Summer festivals feel appropriate during winter storms. Seasonal traditions become random decorative choices. Plant cycles provide no temporal information. Flower blooming appears unrelated to specific months. Leaf changes feel like random color shifts. Natural rhythms become incomprehensible background events. Agricultural connections disappear completely. Growing seasons become meaningless concepts. Harvest times provide no useful information. Food production cycles fade into historical curiosity. Seasonal depression and energy cycles flatten into monotonous emotional baselines. Mood variations lose connection to daylight duration. Energy levels become independent of solar patterns. The isolated mind lives in eternal generic weather without seasonal meaning. Fingers trace empty spaces where business cards once lived. The wallet contains nameless plastic rectangles. Identity documents become meaningless government decorations. Personal history evaporates like morning mist. Childhood memories disconnect from current consciousness. School experiences belong to unknown strangers. Professional achievements feel like borrowed stories. The mirror reflects unfamiliar facial arrangements. Name recognition disappears entirely. John and Sarah become random sound combinations. Personal identity becomes an empty filing cabinet. Birth certificates contain information about mysterious other people. Photo albums display strangers wearing familiar faces. Family trees describe unknown biological connections. Personal documents become archaeological artifacts. Past accomplishments feel completely foreign. Career success belongs to different individuals. Educational degrees represent stranger achievements. Life timeline becomes a disconnected historical sequence. Memory banks contain only generic human experiences without personal ownership. Specific details about individual existence simply vanish. Personal narrative becomes impossible to construct or maintain. The isolated consciousness becomes an anonymous observer without biographical context. The bathroom becomes territory requiring four-legged patrol routes. Hands prefer contact with floor surfaces over vertical posture. Upright walking feels unnatural and exhausting. Human classification becomes questionable category. Mirror reflections reveal strange bipedal creatures. Walking upright feels like elaborate performance art. Natural movement patterns involve crawling and climbing. Speech attempts produce animal vocalizations. Barking feels more natural than conversation. Growling expresses emotions more accurately than words. Human language becomes a foreign communication system. Clothing restrictions irritate skin unnecessarily. Fabric becomes an uncomfortable constraint. Nakedness feels appropriate and natural. Textile coverings represent arbitrary human conventions. Tool usage becomes a mysterious activity. Forks and knives serve no apparent purpose. Complex implements require impossible motor coordination. Simple objects become incomprehensible technological artifacts. Human social behaviors appear bizarre and artificial. Standing conversations seem uncomfortable and forced. Sitting in chairs feels unstable and precarious. Natural positions involve floor contact and territorial awareness. The isolated being questions its membership in human species classification. Professional uniforms hang like costumes from forgotten theater productions. Career responsibilities evaporate into meaningless role-playing activities. Work identity becomes historical curiosity without personal connection. Gender distinctions lose all significance. Male and female become arbitrary biological categories. Sexual identity dissolves into a relevant classification system. Reproductive roles feel like zoological functions. Age categories become meaningless numerical assignments. Adult responsibilities represent incomprehensible social agreements. Childhood and maturity blend into a single experiential category. Age-appropriate behavior becomes a foreign concept. Social relationships reduce to basic territorial arrangements. Family connections become biological coincidence. Friendship transforms into temporary proximity tolerance. Human bonding becomes simplified resource-sharing agreement. Cultural identity markers disappear completely. National allegiance feels like random geographical assignment. Ethnic characteristics become accidental physical variations. Cultural practices represent elaborate group rituals without personal meaning. Educational achievements become irrelevant historical decorations. Professional credentials lose all compelling significance. Social status markers transform into meaningless competitive displays. The isolated consciousness becomes a socially undefined entity existing outside human categories. Arms move independently like mechanical appendages operated by remote control. The torso feels borrowed from an unknown previous owner. Legs function as transportation equipment rather than personal body parts. Hands appear during peripheral vision as surprising strangers. Finger movements require conscious coordination efforts. Manual dexterity becomes deliberate mechanical operation. Personal limbs become unfamiliar tools. Facial features belong to different individuals wearing identical masks. Eye contact with reflections feels like meeting foreign persons. Facial expressions operate independently of internal emotional states. Personal appearance becomes costume worn by anonymous consciousness. Body temperature regulation feels external rather than internal. Hunger and thirst arrive like weather conditions affecting borrowed equipment. Physical needs become environmental pressures rather than personal requirements. Pain and pleasure register as information about mechanical systems rather than personal experiences. Physical sensations become data reports from distant monitoring stations. Bodily feedback becomes impersonal equipment status updates. Internal body awareness dissolves entirely. Heartbeat becomes background machinery noise. Breathing operates as an automatic life support system. Physical existence becomes temporary residence rather than personal identity. Consciousness becomes tenant renting space inside unfamiliar biological architecture. Morning light reveals completely unfamiliar living spaces. Eyes open into existence without historical context. Yesterday vanishes into prehistoric archaeological periods. Each awakening brings total biographical reset. Previous days become ancient history belonging to different civilizations. Continuous identity breaks into isolated daily episodes. Personal timeline fragments into disconnected experiential islands. Sleep periods create complete memory barriers. Dreams and waking consciousness become separate universes. Previous identity versions feel like historical figures from distant eras. Consciousness becomes a series of unrelated temporary existences. Daily rediscovery becomes routine experience. Familiar objects require fresh examination every morning. Known spaces demand complete re-exploration. Routine activities need fundamental relearning. Identity continuity dissolves across time boundaries. Morning person feels unrelated to evening person. Different daily phases become separate individuals sharing common physical space. Single consciousness splits into multiple temporary residents. Personal development stops functioning entirely. Growth requires memory connections across time periods. Learning becomes impossible without biographical continuity. Self-improvement transforms into daily starting over exercises. The isolated mind becomes temporary visitor, experiencing endless first days without accumulated wisdom. Metal utensils feel cold and threatening against fingertips. The fork becomes a dangerous weapon rather than an eating implement. Hands recoil from shaped metal surfaces. Silverware transforms into incomprehensible artifacts. Knife blades appear menacing and purposeless. Spoon curves serve no recognizable function. Eating utensils become mysterious archaeological relics. Fingers prefer direct food contact. Bare hands scoop liquids more naturally than manufactured tools. Nails tear meat more efficiently than cutting implements. Natural body parts replace all artificial extensions. Complex mechanisms become impossible puzzles. Door handles require enormous concentration. Light switches operate through accidental contact rather than intentional manipulation. Simple technologies become advanced engineering challenges. Manufactured objects lose all apparent utility. Scissors become decorative metal arrangements. Can openers transform into abstract sculptures? Kitchen implements serve no comprehensible purpose. Tool construction becomes a forgotten art form. Stick modification stops occurring. Rock shaping disappears entirely. Equipment creation becomes a lost civilization skill. Hands become the only reliable instruments in an increasingly foreign technological landscape. Smoke rises from forgotten cooking experiments. Raw meat feels more appetizing than heated preparations. Fire becomes an unnecessary complication rather than a food improvement. Cooked textures trigger nausea responses. Heated vegetables taste artificially modified. Baked goods feel overly processed and indigestible. Cooking transforms food into unnatural substances. Teeth prefer tearing fresh materials. Jaws work more effectively on unmodified food sources. Chewing patterns adapt to raw resistance levels. Dental function returns to primitive efficiency. Seasoning becomes overwhelming sensory assault. Salt tastes like chemical contamination. Spices trigger rejection responses. Flavor enhancement feels like food poisoning. Preparation rituals disappear completely. Washing becomes an unnecessary step. Cutting reduces natural food integrity. Processing removes essential nutritional elements that only exist in original states. Hunger drives immediate consumption without delay. Food storage becomes irrelevant activity. Preservation techniques feel like elaborate time-wasting ceremonies. Fresh consumption becomes the only acceptable option. The isolated being rediscovers eating as a direct biological function rather than cultural performance. The hallway stretches endlessly ahead, requiring impossible bipedal navigation. Knees drop toward familiar floor contact. Vertical posture becomes exhausting architectural challenge. Upright walking triggers balance problems. Two-legged movement feels precarious and unstable. Standing requires enormous muscular effort. Bipedal locomotion becomes an advanced acrobatic feat. Floor contact provides security and stability. Four-point movement feels natural and efficient. Crawling covers distances more comfortably than walking. Ground-level navigation becomes preferred travel method. Stairs become impossible vertical challenges. Steps require four-limbed climbing techniques. Elevation changes demand animal-style solutions. Architectural features become natural obstacles, requiring primitive approaches. Furniture transforms into climbing opportunities rather than sitting surfaces. Chairs become launching platforms. Tables provide elevated rest positions. Household objects become jungle gym equipment. Vertical posture becomes temporary emergency position rather than default stance. Standing occurs only for specific reaching requirements. Normal existence happens closer to ground level. Movement patterns return to quadrupedal efficiency after 20 years of forgotten bipedal experimentation. Fabric threads scratch against oversensitive skin surfaces. Clothing tags burn like tiny torture devices. Textile contact triggers immediate removal urges. Shirts become restrictive straitjackets limiting natural movement. Pants transform into leg prisons, preventing proper locomotion. Shoes feel like foot cages blocking ground sensation. Clothing becomes external punishment system. Skin breathes freely without fabric interference. Air circulation feels natural and necessary. Temperature regulation operates more efficiently without textile barriers. Nakedness becomes normal baseline condition. Seasonal protection becomes a necessary concern. Cold and heat feel manageable through natural adaptation. Weather exposure strengthens rather than threatens biological systems. Climate becomes environmental challenge rather than clothing emergency. Textile manufacturing becomes incomprehensible industrial process. Fabric creation serves no apparent useful purpose. Clothing production represents elaborate civilization waste. Woven materials become decorative rather than functional. Social modesty disappears without social witnesses. Covering becomes meaningless activity. Privacy concerns evaporate in complete isolation. Nakedness becomes natural and unremarkable default state. The isolated body operates like a wild animal, comfortable in its original skin. The doorway marks an absolute boundary, demanding constant vigilance. Invisible intruders press against the perimeter. Space ownership becomes life or death priority. Every object needs constant position checking through the day. Furniture displacement triggers instant alarm responses. Possession arrangement becomes a sacred map of placement. Territory violation becomes a terminal risk. Invisible boundary lines split the living space into claimed zones. Specific areas become exclusive personal kingdoms. Room sections develop their own warning habits. Space becomes a patchwork of claimed rooms, not one shared home. Imaginary intruders seem to arrive from every direction. Door sounds trigger full-body bracing. Window movements spark the same hard territorial reflex in the spine. Phantom signals keep the nerves on and ready. Personal possessions become precious resources that must stay close. Food hoarding becomes survival necessity. Object accumulation creates reserve piles near resting areas. Everything becomes a potential tool in a sudden lunge. Marking behaviors emerge for territory identification. Scent placement becomes boundary maintenance activity. Personal signature spreads throughout claimed spaces. Ownership becomes physical rather than legal concept. The isolated being transforms into a territorial animal guarding sacred space against shapes that are not there.